I love how it's either super bright or super dull, and there is no in between at all. Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I am back to talk about one of the books that I have read the most recently, which is The Outcasts of Time by Ian Mortimer. Now you might recognise the name Ian Mortimer because he is the author of the very popular Time Traveller's Guide series, which are a collection of popular histories. The concept being, if you were a time traveller to different periods, what would you see, what would you do, what would you wear, etc., peppered in with some historical fact and events. Currently we have The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England, which says it's medieval England. It is largely just the 14th century rather than a sweeping narrative of the whole medieval period. The Time Traveller's Guide to Elizabethan England, and The Time Traveller's Guide to Restoration Britain, and there is due to be a fourth instalment coming out in November, which is The Time Traveller's Guide to Regency England. And I would say that The Outcasts of Time is basically the fictional equivalent of these books. It is exactly the kind of book that you would expect to come out of this author. So The Outcasts of Time follows two brothers, John and William, who are travelling through Exeter in 1348 as the Black Death is ravaging England. Whilst journeying away from home, one of the brothers' attempts to do a good deed leads to them contracting the disease and realising that they are inevitably going to die and have very few days left on this earth. However, just as things are starting to seem completely lost, both of the brothers each individually hear a voice giving them a choice. They can either spend their last remaining 6 days on Earth in 1348, giving them an opportunity to say goodbye to their friends and families, or on each of the remaining 6 days left to them, they will be transported 99 years into the future. Their deaths will still be inevitable, but during this time their symptoms will be completely relieved. Realising that the choice to stay in their present day of 1348 would inevitably lead to their family and friends contracting the disease, the two brothers decide that they will take their chances on the future, each day waking up in 1447, 1546, 1645, 1774, 1843, and then finally 1942. When I read about the concept of this book, I was very much intrigued, and I was very pleased to find that this book lived up to expectations, and I really did enjoy it. Though it is not a book that I would necessarily say that everybody must go out and read. I do think there are some things that will be a bit of a hindrance to other people's enjoyment. As I mentioned in my reading wrap-up, this book does get a little bit info dumpy. You end up getting a lot of information about each time period very quickly as Ian Mortimer tries to build up the setting and the feel and the atmosphere of each time period as quickly as humanly possible. Due to the plot, there is only 24 hours in which to convey a lot of information. You'll often get big long passages where characters are verbally giving John and William lots of information, lots of facts and events that have happened in this time period, to a point that is necessary for you to really immerse yourself in this world and in this plot, but at some points you do kind of think to yourself, is this really how people would naturally talk? Is this a conversation that people would actually have? I don't know. And I felt at some points like I could really feel Ian Mortimer trying to maintain that balance of how much information is enough and how much is just too much and is info dumping. How much of it is just unnecessary details that the audience do not need. Which on the one hand is good because it means that Ian Mortimer was being very conscious of his audience and conscious not to be too overwhelming with all of the historical fact and information. On the other hand, it can sometimes kind of take you out of the story to really feel that authorial intent on the page, as opposed to what you kind of want, which is for the plot and the story to kind of flow naturally as if there isn't an author working things out. And I recognise that that is a really hard balance to maintain. One thing that I actually really think helped in the experience of this book was that I listened to it on audiobook. This is something I often find is very helpful in historical fiction. It really helps me immerse myself into a world, so it might be a better option for you rather than physically reading it on the page. I know that I am often quite liable to glossing over and scanning over very descriptive passages that I don't often feel are important to the plot, whereas having the audiobook really forced me to have to listen to every single word that is being said, and it helps in this book. In terms of more general points about this book, I really liked that Ian Mortimer chose to set it in Exeter rather than being too tempted to set it somewhere more prominent like London. I mean, Exeter is still a very prominent place, but it isn't as big and sprawling as London. I felt like setting it there really helped to ground the story and the history and really helped to focus it down. I feel like it just would have been a bit too crowd pleasery to set it in London, and it would have been all too tempting to try and cram in lots of famous figures that you wouldn't necessarily need. I also think with this concept there was always a real worry that it might start to get a little bit monotonous and stale, you know, just like another Groundhog Day, with the twist being that every day is 99 years set in the future. That the plot would just end up being the same thing over and over again, you know, them waking up in the new time period period being confused, not knowing how to handle it, rinse, repeat. However, partway through the book, there is a little bit of a twist, which I'm not going to give away, but it is one that I did not see coming, and it did get me. And this twist not only alleviates the worry of there being some sort of staleness with the plot, but it also really adds to the emotional stakes of the book and also to character development. It's a twist that really ties into the overall broader themes of the book, and I really, really liked it, even though it did leave me going, oh my god! So going into the broader themes of the book, one of the major focuses of the Outcasts of Time is the discussion on, as you go through the centuries, what seems to change and what seems to stay the same, and in so being able to pinpoint what stays the same, what can we say is universal about humanity? What is it about humanity that we can hold up as a universal truth? As you can imagine, as each day goes by, John and William are confronted constantly by different changes that they see, and they find these changes incredibly, incredibly hard to deal with. I tried to keep a little list where I kept track of each year that they landed in and what changes they picked up upon, and my list is not exhaustive but includes, in 4047, the main 3 changes that I picked up upon was the language. Some of the slang was very, very different, and this is something that I will say might be a little bit of a hindrance to the enjoyment for people who are more into their medieval history, is the fact that John and William are not picked up upon for the way that they talk as much as you would expect them to. I'm going to link below a video by Simon Whistler where he talks about how far back in time could you go and still be able to communicate with somebody effectively in English, which could lead to the argument that maybe John and William would not have been understood quite as readily by the later centuries as Ian Mortimer is trying to assert that they would be. It only seems to be in the 15th and 16th centuries that they're really pulled up upon the fact that their accents sound a little bit weird, and you'd think surely as they go further and further through time, they can't have picked up, you know, modern English within that one 24-hour period. But yes, in 1447, they are picked up upon for some of the slang that they use, some of the language being a little bit antiquated, the fact that years are being recorded in a different way than they are used to. John and William are very much used to recording their date of birth by regnal year. He gives his date of birth as, I was born in like the 8th year of Edward II, and everyone's like, what? What year is that? And they're like, I don't know. They also recognise that the lay of the land is a bit different. Then as they get into 1546, they see even more changes. Something that was interesting that I picked up was that they did not recognise a clock when they saw it, but they did recognise a gun, really going to show how much inventions towards weaponry and fighting seem to develop much, much quicker than time and space. They are confronted by changes in clothing, though I'd say the biggest changes that they come across is, of course, the religion change, because at this point there has been the break from Rome. However, along with this change in religions, there is also a change in the respect of the people for the king, because as they land in 1546, we are getting into the last couple of years of Henry VIII's life. 2 major things that John and William had always taken for granted, you know, number 1, respect for the king, number 2, respect for the church, and particularly the church in Rome, have completely been destroyed. And this is further exacerbated as they jump the next day into 1645, in the middle of the English Civil War. Of course, the massive change that they are seeing now is that the king is being fought against by his people, by his parliament. Once again, they are confronted by religious change and reform. They are confronted by a much stronger Protestantism than they had in the century previous. However, there are also smaller everyday things that have changed, such as food. This is the first time that they are confronted by mirrors. They go into somebody's home and they see instruments that they have never seen before. Something that I found quite hilarious was the fact that there was outrage about women's hair being down. Shock horror. There is discussion about the Americas, which of course, for somebody who was born in the 14th century, you'd just be like, phew. They are also instantly confronted by the fact that the climate, the temperature has changed. It is much, much colder in 1645. Next up, in 1744, even more changes, particularly to do with inventions, are confronted. We see how now it is fashionable for houses to be made of brick, which is very confronting. Not only that, but houses are bigger. We are also confronted by the effect of the empire, particularly in material culture, with the introduction of coffee and tobacco into the story. We also see the dominating print culture, with words being everywhere, which for the illiterate brother John is a really, really hard adjustment to make. Suddenly, words are everywhere in the way that they never were in his day. Then fast forward to the 19th century, 1843, we also see a massive change in sanitation. In the previous century, something that had always stayed the same in John's mind was the fact that it always smelt terribly, that there was always some sort of dirt and excrement smelling up the streets. However, we are starting to see massive shifts in sanitation developments and medicine. And as you'd expect, there are massive changes in industry and inventions, and he is so overwhelmed by the amount of inventions that are there in the 19th century. century. The final day, the 20th century, in 1942, we are really confronted by something that has not seemed to change, which is the effect of war. It's noted in the Outcasts of Time that there only seems to be one day, which is 1843, where Britain do not seem to be fighting somebody. They take it for granted that it's always going to be the French that have fought, and are very surprised by the fact that no, we're not fighting the French are actually our allies, we're fighting the Germans this time round. It seems a very pitiable thing that we always seem to be fighting somebody, no matter how far advanced we get with inventions and how the centuries seem to go by. War, sadly, for this book seems to be a universal human thing. As I mentioned in my wrap-up, I feel like this would be a fantastic book to give to kind of explain to people how the centuries prior to like the 18th, 19th century with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution were not just like a big monotonous sludge where things hardly ever changed, that actually there were massive developments going on in these centuries prior. I think something that really hits home with this book is how you can never guarantee what is going to stay the same. For John and William, they take for granted that there are going to be new inventions with each passing day that goes by. However, things that they are sure are going to stay the same, like the monarch, like religion, these big things that you hold your entire life to, they seem to be flipped on their head within an instant. Big feats that you accomplish in your lifetime that you think are going to guarantee you everlasting fame are not assured. One particularly poignant line from this subject goes as thus: "There are times in life when the cycle of ages and the destruction of one generation's work by the next is an uplifting thing, for it promises the young so much. And then there are times later in life when you realise it means that your work too will be swept away. Honestly, the only way to secure everlasting fame is to produce such a fine work that no age will ever rival it." However, as we are immediately confronted by this book, how can you assure that no age is ever going to rival what you make? There is no way of knowing that. I think what this book is also very good at explaining to us is the ways in which progress is never linear. History is not just this smooth sailing one thing to another. Whilst life is certainly getting better as we see through the book, it's never a straight line. For example, the brother William is quite a promiscuous young man. He is in many ways a bit of a misogynist. He isn't very much into the idea of women reading and has quite a meh attitude to the idea of women gaining political power. However, when he finds out about 17th century Puritan views on women, and especially women in regards to adultery and the ways that women would be executed for adultery, his reaction is very much like, what? He's like, hang on a sec, it takes two to tango, why are you blaming the women but not the men? Maybe you wouldn't necessarily expect from a man from the 14th century. Another major theme in this book is the idea of the one good act, really questioning what is it that we live our lives for and what does it mean to be a good person. One of the brothers, John, is particularly motivated to do good works, particularly prompted by his faith. However, right at the beginning of the book, we see how his call to do those good works often leads to trouble. The second brother, William, on the other hand, is a bit more self-seeking. He's a bit more cunning. In a lot of ways, he is much more street smart than his brother. He is much more worldly and more realistic, and he gets very, very frustrated by John's idealism. However, something that he is confronted with very, very quickly in the course of this book is that because he has lived only for himself, he has not made quite as much of a mark upon the world. Because the two brothers are wanting to use their 6 days to do good works and to try and find a way of reclaiming their lives from hell and to get into heaven, they are constantly being confronted by what makes a good act. However, they end up very quickly being confronted by the realization that doing good works purely for your own self-benefit, that it is inherently selfish. Therefore, can that act really be considered good? It reminded me very much of the Friends episode. I think it's the one where Phoebe hates PBS, where Joey and Phoebe are in a bit of an argument because Joey argues that there is no such thing as a selfless good act, because regardless of how good the act may be, the fact that you get joy from doing good means that it is inherently selfish. I was very much reminded of that episode when I read this book. This book was incredibly bleak in a lot of ways because of this overlying message, and because it seems so often that people are not doing good, that they are much more self-interested and self-involved. However, despite much of the negativity that John and William see in the course of their journey through the book, we do in every age seem to see at least one or two individuals who do demonstrate acts of kindness out of the goodness of their hearts, not because they think they will get a reward, but because it's the right thing to do. The final major theme of this book is really about why is it that we study history? What use is it to know about the past when when we need to focus so much on our present self. As I said in my wrap-up for September about this book, it was really interesting reading this during the middle of a pandemic, especially reading right at the beginning when the two brothers are journeying through Black Death England. There were so many parallels I could see, particularly to like March time of this year, when there was a lot of distrust when you were going out and about your daily lives, but lockdown had not officially been announced. However, obviously in this book it was amplified up to 1,000. Just this feeling of unease and distrust and not knowing where to turn, and like if you hear somebody coughing or showing any symptoms, you're just like, oh. However, I also feel in many ways like reading this right now was the perfect time to read it, because through the different time periods of this book you are confronted by so many different instances in so many different ages where something bad is happening and everybody seems to think the world is ending, where great change is happening and people are very uncomfortable with it, because we as humans do not like change. I think if we can count on any universal truth, it is that humans don't really like change very much. And in many ways, we are confronted by times where we think we don't know necessarily how we will go on. However, as far as this book is concerned, life does seem to go on even after we have these big halts. In some ways, even though this book was really quite bleak, it also gave me just a little bit of hope that even though things are terrible right now, that hopefully we will come out the other side, that things will be different, but hopefully we will be prompted to make big changes that will hopefully improve everybody's lives. I think the overall summary of this book that I gave was that it's kind of like a history of Britain meets It's a Wonderful Life, tied in with a little bit of A Christmas Carol, because it is really a story of looking back on your life or the lives of others and thinking how much have you impacted on those people, how much goodness and kindness have you shown, and how does that reverberate through the years. Like I say, it's not a book that is going to be for everybody, but it's one that I really wanted to highlight and lift up because I've not heard people talking too much about it. I've done a little bit more digging recently into Ian Mortimer's backlist, and there is another non-fiction book which I think really pairs well with this that I do want to get to, which is The Centuries of Change, where he is really analysing the different centuries and which one of those centuries had the greatest impact on our society. So I will definitely be getting round to that soon. And yeah, I really recommend this book if it sounds interesting to you. It was a really interesting read, a really poignant read, and I think now was the right time to read it, especially as a big history fan. Let me know if you picked up this book or if you're interested in reading it. Once again, let me know about any historical fiction recommendations prompted by this that you think that I might enjoy. I hope you're all having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye!